amid the rise and fall of empires, a nomadic people made what might be the greatest journey of all. They traverse across the oceans, led by the mighty British Empire, into a new land where they seek the promise of a better life. Starting with small shops, they would build a commercial stronghold, and by bonding together in this new land, they forge another identity over succeeding generations. This is the story of their journey and of their legacy, the bonds of Promised Land. It's the early 19th century, and the British Empire is on track to become the largest empire in history.
The British took advantage of ongoing improvements in shipbuilding and navigational techniques to establish real supremacy in naval exploits. By the end of the 1700s, Britain was the undisputed and preeminent naval power on the planet, and it ruled both in the Caribbean and the Pacific and across all oceans, thus leading to the popularization of the phrase, the empire on which the sun never sets.
Britain's rule in the Caribbean was founded on the sugar plantations that provided great wealth to the empire through a triangular trade of slaves from West Africa for goods made in Britain, and then, ultimately, sugar from the West Indies. Sugar had become England's most valuable import in the 1700s. However, events at the turn of the century would threaten this fortune. The abolition movement, which gathered steam following the 1807 decision to end Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade, would have serious consequences for the Caribbean colonies. The 19th century thus brought a shift in the strategic importance of the British colonies. Having lost its 13 American colonies 2 decades prior, and the Caribbean plantations now challenged by removal of the slave trade and competing sugar beet production in Europe, Britain turned east, where the empire began gaining ground through the East India Company.
The Dutch had already successfully established a trading company to deal with their affairs in the colonies they had established in the Far East, mainly Indonesia. And seeing this, the British decided to establish what became known as the British East India Company to deal with the exploitation of resources in their colonies and beyond, particularly tea from India and also opium from Afghanistan and the Near East, as well as goods that they would eventually trade with China.
The powerful East India Company had gained a monopoly over opium production in India and began shipping opium to China as part of another triangular trade between India, Guangzhou in China, and Britain.
Britain, like a number of the other European territories, had at least 2 or so centuries of trade with China, but that trade had been largely one-sided, as of course there was huge demand amongst the European nobility for Chinese materials, silks, porcelain, and definitely for tea. But the Chinese, regarding the Europeans to be an inferior culture, naturally also suspected that their goods would be inferior and offered and insisted rather to be paid in silver for their commodities. This of course created a drain on the exchequer of the British, and they were anxious to really solve this imbalance and not really making a lot of headway in it until round about the middle of the 1700s to late 1700s, when opium started to be cultivated in large quantities in India and Afghanistan and to be shipped into China.
Opium became the game changer for British interest in China.
During 1820, China was completely closed to foreign powers, and in order to penetrate China, Britain used opium as a means of trade. China was a nation of opium addicts, and there was an estimated of over 13 million males who are addicts.
It was serious enough to warrant a letter from an official of the imperial government to Queen Victoria herself, urging Britain to cease or clamp down on what was still an illegal trade.
The emperor appointed one Lin Zizhu, a well-noted scholar, to be a commissioner, a special commissioner to deal with the problem. And Zizhu decided that he would try diplomacy with a bit of moral suasion at the beginning to say, well, since Britain clearly opposed the opium trade within its own borders, how could it then sanction the trade and profit within China? And he sent a letter to that effect to Queen Victoria herself. The official report is that the letter never arrived, but most experts and even laymen could probably offer quite a few reasons as to the circumstances behind that letter not arriving.
Opium dollars were swelling royal coffers.
A Britain at the peak of 100 years of prosperous expansion. Behind that Ascot elegance was a strength that no other nation could challenge.
And the traders themselves had no intention of giving up such a hugely profitable enterprise.
Frustrated with the lack of response and seeing the problem grow and worried, of course, that he would have to answer to the imperial power, Lin switched from good cop to bad cop. He confiscated opium supplies within Chinese borders, even actually jailed a few of the traders, and went so far as to board British ships just outside the jurisdiction of Chinese waters with a view to relieving their cargoes of opium. And these last two measures, specifically the arrest of British nationals in China and the boarding of British ships, proved to be more than the government could handle and forced their hand essentially to escalate the tension between the two countries.
When China tried to stop the trade of opium, they were defeated in the First Opium War in 1840. With the defeat of China, they were forced to open its port to foreign nationals, including Britain.
The First Opium War ended on September 2, 1841, with the signing of the Treaty of Peking. It was to have several consequences germane to our story.
Britain therefore expanded both its military and commercial presence in the region, and we saw a lot of upheaval for the imperial government in China thereafter, leading to rebellions, floods.
The waters sweep over dikes and spread across the city, bringing with them again their toll of death, disease, and destruction.
The emperor, he must strengthen the actual numbers of forces, which leads them to take the decision to conscript, which is to force persons from all over the territory into mandatory military service, a move which certainly didn't go down well with the peasantry. Farmers, of course, way outside of Nanjing and Beijing, loath to leave their cultivations and their families and to join in with the empire, which they felt had really done very little to improve their lot in life.
After the Opium War, the country were broke. People were hungry, there was poverty, mainly along the coastline. So with very little work, with very little food and resources, signing up for the indentureship was a way out for many of the Hakka tribes.
In addition to the economic distress, the imperial government was racked by social and political unrest.
There was a Taiping Rebellion when we had, under the leadership of a Hakka person called Hung Zikwan, an uprising beginning in the region around Canton, presently Guangdong, Guangzhou city. And this gained momentum, and thousands and millions of people followed the leaders of this movement to gain equality and some prosperity in a time when everything looked hopeless. So that was one of the major things going on. And that, in fact, moved northwards towards China and culminated in the Taiping settling in the city of Nanjing, the southern capital, for 10 years. Besides that, there was the local clashes between the Punti, the local people, the Cantonese, and the so-called visiting people, the Hakka and others like them. So this, in fact, was a low-grade conflict, but broke into open war shortly after 1855.
The discovery of gold in faraway lands such as California on the American mainland and South Africa, as well as construction of the Panama Railroad, created calls for the able-bodied and adventurous.
Besides the great political instability in China, there were economic factors such as the great movement towards industrialization in the West. There was the increase in the production of cotton, clothing instead of silk, and in particular tea was being grown in Assam in India. As well, people were looking for more manufactured goods all over the world. So this led to a great decline in the Chinese economy, and in the local villages, people were really looking for a chance to migrate, to gain wealth, and they had heard of these vast gold fields in Australia and in California and in Alaska, the so-called Gumsan, Gold Mountain. So these legends, plus the immense poverty in China, really made them ready to go out of China.
The enterprises that were seeking workers had recruiters going around the countryside making really extravagant promises about the opportunities that awaited anyone who would cross the seas. And so some were recruited legitimately, meaning they signed papers and so on. Some were simply shanghaied, that's where the word came from. They were scraped up.
And they often use the term 买猪仔, like selling a pig.
The people who left China to come to Jamaica and Panama were young men in the prime of their life. Some of them were married and left children behind. Others were single men.
At that time, they didn't have any women who signed on to the indentureship because respectable women do not travel at that time. They will not leave the village. The primary job is to stay home and become housewives.
Taking advantage of this desperation, the British shipped thousands of Chinese to various parts of their empire, including the British Caribbean. The departing Chinese came from Guangdong province in southern China.
There was a particular Chinese group called the Hakka, and they had migrated from the north of China in the Yellow River region, starting in AD 317. They continued south over 5 distinct stages and arrived in the region of Guangdong province, immediately facing the island of Hong Kong. And they were known to be good immigrants, both certainly in China and already in Southeast Asia.
The Hakka Tribe is really a tribe of people, and Hakka means the guest people, okay, which means that they are not from here, okay, they are coming from somewhere, okay. And in China, you find that they usually live on the mountainside. Being guest people, you would not have the flat land to live on, okay, so you normally live on the mountainside. And then you live there, and then for a while, and then you move on, okay, to another place, okay. Hence, Hakka, okay. They have their own dialects. They have their own, set of tradition and culture, okay.
From the mid-1800s onwards, these Hakka would continue their migration, this time to even more distant lands.
People were on the move in China to escape the dire conditions of their lives. And that move coincided with Western recruiters trying to import labor from China for Eastern and Western enterprises, such as railroads, agriculture, and so on. So that's the context for that migration to the West Indies and Panama.
The type of contract that a typical Chinese indentured worker would have signed at that time would be 3 years with wages and a return trip back to China.
And the Chinese were promised a garden, medical attention, and some limited housing. All these things were promised.
Slavery was officially abolished in most of the British Empire on August 1, 1834.
I believe there are a number of reasons why slavery ended when it did in the Caribbean. And part of the reasons, I think, is first of all, the ferocity, intensity, extensiveness of the slave revolts. Jamaica, according to most reputable social historians, has the distinction of being the most rebellious slave colony of all. Our people just were not prepared to take those conditions of life. So the ferocity and intensity of the slave rebellions would have been number one. The second reason, of course, is that slavery became less economically profitable as a system to the slave owners, and therefore the economic incentive would have been diminished. And thirdly, the fact is that there was a very powerful anti-slavery movement amongst the more liberal, educated, progressive persons in England, and that anti-slavery movement, combined with the economic unprofitability of slavery, most of all faced with the continuous and increasingly intensive slave revolts, those three led to the decision to abolish slavery against the will of the slave owners in Jamaica.
The British establishment first resorted to white laborers from Europe.
So that is the Scots and Germans who came in, were actually placed in the highlands of Jamaica in order to cut off access to the highlands by the ex-enslaved and to force them to remain on the estates. The Chinese and the Indians were eventually brought in partly to swell the labor force and therefore reduce the cost of labor. Some people at the colonial office thought that it would have been much cheaper and far more efficient to pay a higher wage to black labor rather than go to the horrible expense of bringing people from Asia.
The Chinese came to Jamaica following the abolition of slavery, when the African slaves were offered apprenticeship on the estates, when they would be paid some kind of salary and be trained in this system of work during the apprenticeship period. However, most Africans did not want to be back on the plantations because that was so close to slavery in their mind. They preferred to go and live freely in the mountains and hills of Jamaica to make their life and grow their own food and develop their own economies.
The first large group of 267 Chinese immigrants came from Hong Kong on July 30, 1854. A few months later that year, more Chinese immigrants would arrive via Panama on a ship called Epsom.
Ships were, particularly by the British, could not leave port without the provisions and the number of doctors and medicines on board being signed off by the agent in Hong Kong or whatever treaty port that was. So the death rates on these voyages were certainly a lot less than the African slave trade. But it seems to me there were equally a large number of mutinies by the Chinese as there were with the African ships. The Chinese indentures were kept below decks, and only one could come on deck at a time, and the guns were placed just where they would be emerging onto the deck. So pretty much that system of control was in force with the coolies as with the slaves.
The conditions were terrible on these boats. They were like floating death traps, really. So the incidents of, so a lot of people died just simply on the voyage, which could take months and months and months, so you can imagine. The one to Panama was only 2 months because that was the fastest ship of its day. The Chinese came to Panama as contract laborers for the Panama Railroad, which was being built by Americans during the 1850s. And in fact, a lot of the labor for that had come from Jamaica. But in 1854, they were trying to really speed up, get to the end of it, really. And so they brought in contract laborers from China, about 1,000 or a little over 1,000. It wasn't a large number. And they were brought in by labor contractors for, I'm not sure how long, but the labor contractors were paid for each laborer brought in, and the laborers earned about $4 a month or something like that. But they came in to a place which was then known as the unhealthiest place on earth. You know, the conditions were so dire.
They were dying in large numbers, very swiftly, because of malaria, yellow fever, and the constant rains, and their diet, which included no vegetables.
It was just the most awful conditions under which they worked. So much so that of the 1,100 or so who came on that particular boat, only about 400 survived. And some of those survivors were sent to Jamaica in exchange for Jamaican laborers. But the reason why we know about that particular migration, they went to a place called Matashin, and the story is that an enormous number of them actually committed suicide.
Many of the Chinese died, half of them, within the first 4 or 5 months in Panama. And the company gave out that they had committed suicide in large numbers because of the lack of opium.
And opium was for them a way of relieving the stress each day of this horrendous work that they engaged in. The opium supply was suddenly cut off, and the story goes that this is when they started to commit mass suicide.
They painted an apocalyptic picture of hundreds of Chinese killing themselves or paying others to kill them on a particular day. Now, I find that this kind of reporting was very melodramatic and probably self-serving and made a good story to the investors in New York City who were anxious for the railroad to be completed at this point. I prefer to believe the reports given by the British team which went to China to negotiate the transfer. And this team included Mr. Wang, an interpreter, a very young, brilliant young Mandarin, who reported that about 30 to 40 had committed suicide.
We have reports of these Chinese in Panama from this interpreter. And he was also the one who arranged for the survivors to be shipped off to Jamaica. I think 210 of them came. And they arrived, they were ill, in very bad condition. Some of them survived and became agricultural workers.
Many of the 200-plus Chinese who came from Panama had to be taken to hospital in Kingston, where several eventually died. Less than 50 immigrants survived. Another set of Chinese indentured workers arrived a decade later from Trinidad and British Guyana to work on American-owned plantations of coconuts, bananas, and sugar. The Chinese indentured workers were sent to estates all over Jamaica, where they worked as the former African slaves would.
Work on the plantation was extremely difficult. Many were not used to the hard work of cane field, and the weather was extremely hot. They were suffering from lack of opium, so they often substitute alcohol for opium. Many indentured workers did not renew their contract after.
As indentured laborers, the Chinese were treated almost as slaves, in some cases worse, because during slavery, the owner was permanently responsible for the slaves. But under indenture, when the person had concluded their indenture, the owners didn't have to be responsible for them at all. So in that way, we might say they were treated worse than slaves. On the other hand, things had improved, and people were being treated more humanely.
The Chinese were particularly fussy about having the terms of their contract fulfilled, because planters were quite accustomed to refusing to pay after your work had been done, or if they thought that the work had not been done, absolutely to their satisfaction, no wage. If an act of God prevented you doing your work, you paid for it as an indentured workers. And the Chinese, as a matter of fact, on more than one occasion, actually rioted in protest against this.
In fact, their discontent with the harsh conditions led to the first recorded strike of paid workers in Jamaica, when Chinese workers at Duckenfield Estate in St. Thomas staged a sit-down strike.
Ultimately, the The protest was to move off the estates as quickly as possible.
After the Chinese completed their contracts during the indenture period, they immediately left the estates. They didn't go far. They were often on the fringes of the estates, and they took on the job of supplying the workers with their needs. A little cash economy was growing.
Thus ends the Chinese indentured period and sees the birth and spread of these small Chinese grocers alongside a new class of immigrants.
And one of the first things that the Chinese provided was imported salted codfish from Canada. So they became to be called saltfish shops.
Initially, it was a one-man operation where an individual just deal with the whole running of the business.
And all over Jamaica, they were dotted with grocery stores.
At Seafort, we had 7 Chinese shops. All 7 shops sold dry goods.
Clothes, hats and shoes, whether it was rum, whether it was a kerosene oil or the saltfish, anything that you wanted.
Almost every corner, Mr. Chin had a shop. And funny enough to us, every Chinese was Mr. Chin.
The Chinese shopkeepers were able to provide the community with not just provisions, but also with credit, which people may say is a form of banking, but it's not really. What really happened is this, that when the community wanted to buy things from the Chinese, they didn't have the funds, so the Chinese shopkeeper would say, okay, come back and pay next week. So it developed and went on like that. So many people to this day will always remember that the Chinese shopkeeper helped him out with his groceries.
So we would have these little red pocket books back in the day, and people would come in and they would send their books with the list of items that they wanted to procure, and we'd supply the goods and we'd make a list of what they had been supplied with. Come the end of the month, they'd send some money, they'd pay off, and they'd be coming in for another set of goods. And so it went on.
As the small grocery business of the Chinese emerged, so did the development of organizations to protect the interests of the Chinese. From as early as 1890, Chin Tung Kao founded the Chinese Benevolent Society at 113 Barry Street in downtown Kingston.
The Chinese Benevolent Society, as it was known then, was formed in 1891 as an offshoot of the Jigongtang, or the Chinese Freemasonry Society, which was formed in 1887. Now, Jigongtang, or the Chinese Freemasonry Society, could not have women in their society. So by 1891, there was a requirement, there was a need for a society or association with both men and women in there. So the Chinese Benevolent Society was formed.
One of their first interventions was the establishment of the Chinese public school in 1920 at 48 Princess Street. The CBA later bought the school, which used Chinese as the language of instruction until 1952, when the curriculum was changed to English. However, the language change led to the demise of the school. The colonial government in early 1900s had become increasingly uneasy about the growing Chinese presence.
By the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th, we would have seen all the waves generally of Chinese immigrants into Jamaica. We have seen the establishment of the Benevolent Society, Benevolent Association, the CBA, and we see the sort of beginnings of regeneration, those Chinese who would have been born in Jamaica, and the numbers increasing. Mindful of this, the Colonial Office decided to take what they consider to be a set of control measures by requiring new immigrants to be able to read and speak or write at least 50 words in English, and also to pay a certain level of fees for processing their arrival. And of course, even though these were couched as general laws against immigrants, they would have naturally affected the incoming Chinese much more, as they were a larger population group at the time.
The immigration laws to deter Chinese from coming to Jamaica were part of a wider apprehension towards the Chinese community and their control of the retail market, which reached a boiling point in July 1918.
There were a number of build-up that lead to the first anti-Chinese riot of 1918.
The war was still on, the First World War.
The Jamaicans saw Chinese as economic competition, and on top of that, Chinese were establishing interracial relationship with Jamaican women.
And it was a time when there was a great deal of shortage of goods in the society. There was hostility as well because of a shortage of goods, apparently prices had gone up in the shops. But the blacks again saw it as being manipulation on the Chinese part to raise prices at a time when things were very hard.
So these kind of misunderstandings about ultimately where your solidarity is are things that can cause the potential for conflict or things that might add to this kind of stereotype or perception of the Chinese being different and separate. So kind of a moment where these tensions, or a moment where we can see these tensions possibly occurring, are in the anti-ethnic riots that happened throughout the 20th century. So 1918, 1965, and 1938, we have these anti-ethnic riots. One of the most interesting being kind of a riot that's specifically targeted in 1918 against Chinese shop owners, when a Chinese shop owner and a police officer kind of get into a tussle over a romantic dispute, and the police officer goes into hiding.
The story spread in the town. It happened in Yorton. It spread that he had in fact not only beaten up the policeman, but had killed him and cut him up and had pickled him to sell as salt pork or salt beef, whatever the case may be. And I think it's significant that the group of 500 who attacked the shop were prepared to believe the story, that the Chinese, some bystanders were heard to comment that, oh, since they ate dog, they would also eat human flesh. So they were quite prepared to believe it.
The Chinese became the scapegoats when hard times fell on the communities. They were regarded as not loyal to the country because the Chinese, carrying out their Confucian duties to support their families, would remit money to China. So that was another feature that made them not likable to local people.
You know, it goes to show that the relationships between the two groups was always at best a sort of fraught with antagonism that would service at the least effort. So that it's not surprising then that there was a second anti-Chinese riot in the 1930s and a third anti-Chinese riot in the 1960s, whereas in fact there has never been any organized rioting against any of the other groups, and certainly not against the white colonial powers.
Reality was that the Chinese were the closest to the lowest income communities, etc. So there is a growing resentment, and they had not integrated into the society to the point where the black masses saw them as Jamaican.
The incidents of July 1918 and the efforts of the colonial powers to restrict their arrival would, however, not deter increased numbers of Chinese coming to Jamaica. With mainland China in a state of turmoil from fighting between the communists, nationalists, and invading Japanese, Chinese migration to Jamaica grew in the 1920s and 1930s. Many of them were businessmen who had heard about the opportunities for opening shops. By 1930, there were over 4,000 Chinese in Jamaica. By 1943, this number would grow to over 6,800, with another 5,500 recorded as mixed African and Chinese descent. So by 1954, there were over 1,000 Chinese-owned enterprises registered in Jamaica.
There are different migratory periods that we can discern among the Chinese themselves. We had the small shopkeepers immediately after the end of indenture, and these grew into a business class where they became wholesalers and in fact distributors, feeding goods into the small shops. This was a whole business class, bakers, restaurant keepers, tradesmen of all kinds, farmers even.
Let me tell you why they went into the retail business, right? That's what my parents told me. They said, if you're going into business and you cannot speak the language of the country, right? Go into a business where the customers come to you and you don't have to go to them, right? And that is why they went into the shop business.
Chinese are born business people. In their genes, the word business is dominant. They are not people who are looking big profits, but they are steady people. From small income, they make great incomes.
They could do this because the Chinese were very, very careful. The first generation didn't spend any money like we would do today. They just saved everything. And the purpose of saving was to provide for the next generation.
The people who were more intelligent and had more, they were more, would I say, they were of a higher status. They were the old sailors that the retailers brought from. And there were many of those along Princess Street, West Street, Beckford Street. And many of the shopkeepers from all over the island would come to town to buy from these people.
The community get to develop a sort of trust into the Chinese, right? Because we have a reputation of being very honest, right? That's our reputation. And we don't business in other people's business, right? We just do our thing. That is why they went into retail business. And then it evolved into supermarkets, and you see what is happening now, right?
That hard work paid off. By 1963, the Chinese would have a dominant presence in the retail trade in Jamaica. This retail base would drive the creation of Chinese Jamaican wealth, but would also be the source of tension and animosity from the still largely disenfranchised Black Jamaicans. Political independence in 1962 brought little in the way of genuine economic change for the rapidly expanding working class. Almost exclusively blacks, they tended to see the Chinese as exploitative and standoffish. Resentment against Chinese Jamaicans again reached a boiling point in 1965.
Potential for riots raise when there's economic insecurity, because those are the moments where your solidarity to the country is especially important. So if the Chinese are not being seen as having solidarity during times of economic insecurity, like 1918, you get things like riots that might occur based on this idea that they're not going to be giving back. And so it's the economics coupled with this idea of culture and idea of what it means to be a Jamaican and who can be a Jamaican and what you do to be a Jamaican that ultimately caused these conflicts to occur.
The cause for the 1965 riot was woman.
It was said that this guy who had a bakery in Spanish Town Road caught one of his girls and stealing. So to discipline her, I think he boxed her. And she ran out and told the community. And that is what started the riot, right? But the riot was not nationally widespread. It was concentrated only in Kingston and downtown Kingston, right? Not upper Kingston. And it was not the riot of the magnitude that you see is happening in Ferguson, Missouri, right? In other words, there was not a wholesale attack like blacks against Chinese, because where we live in a black neighborhood, and all my friends, they did the same thing, and they never get any attack, right? It takes somebody from outside another neighborhood to come into your neighborhood to attack you. And it was almost impossible because you were protected in your own neighborhood, right? Well, it was more like a mob thing. And I never heard of any places getting burned down or anybody getting murdered or anything. One or two of us got injured when we got into the way, right? But the most shocking thing about that riot, was that a delegation of us went to the Chinese embassy. The elders, from a delegation, and went there and said to them, "You see what is happening to us. What can you do to help us?" And the ambassador told them point blank, "We cannot help you because you're not Chinese, you're Jamaicans." Right? That was the most shocking thing to me about that riot, right? Because before that, it gave an impression that you are Chinese. If anything, you want diplomatic help, you could go to the Chinese embassy, right? So it was like a disillusionment to me then, right? You face the reality. You're really not Chinese, right?
The dichotomy of being Chinese and Jamaican has been a peculiar feature of the Chinese-Jamaican story.
In most of my interviews that I've had with Chinese Jamaicans, one of the fundamental things that they say is that they are fundamentally Jamaican, right? So a lot of people talk about how much they love their country. And at this point, when we're in the third and fourth and fifth iteration of generations, people speak Patois, they've gone to Jamaican schools, they've sent their children to Jamaican schools, and these are the stories that they tell you when they're talking about their Jamaicanness. So it's not this kind of and question, or this kind of or question, am I Jamaican or am I Chinese? It's kind of this and, I'm Jamaican and I'm Chinese.
As a community, Chinese Jamaicans have tried vigorously to retain their Chinese culture, especially in the first half of the 20th century, via the Chinese school, Chinese newspapers, Chinese beauty pageant, upholding Confucian principles, and so on.
The Chinese Benevolent Association is trying to teach the culture, right? They have classes and all that, But culture is not a thing that you learn in a classroom, right? You have to live it. So we'll never get it. Now, these came now. They are in a position that my parents are in, right? When they have their children and they begin to mix up with the wider community, they're going to lose that language culture. And then they're going to become like us, right? And a new wave of Chinese is going to come into Jamaica and tell them that they are not Chinese. They only look like Chinese because they don't speak the language, right? I'll give you a joke. I print for some of them, and they refer me to their friends, So I went to this guy, have a restaurant, and he greeted me in Chinese, right? And I answered him in English, and he repeated it, and I repeated the answer in English, and he said, "I thought you were Chinese." I said, "But I am Chinese." He said, "No, you're not Chinese. If you're Chinese, you're speaking Chinese, right?" So I saw he had a daughter. He was about 5 years old, by my estimation, about 5 years old. And I said to him, "You see that girl? I was like her, I used to speak the language, right? But by growing up and mixing up with the wider community, you get to lose it because language needs communication, right? And she's going to become just like me, right? And somebody's going to come and say to her, 'You're not Chinese,' right? Or else you'll be speaking Chinese." And he said to me, No, Mr. Fong, that will never happen because I insist that she speak Chinese to me." And 5 years later, I went up there, and the girl was speaking Patois. I said to him, "Same thing I tell you. See, it's happening already." And he said, "Mr. Fong, I don't know what the hell is wrong with this girl. She refused to speak Chinese." So that's what I'm trying to tell you, right? She's going to evolve into Jamaican like me, right? And that is what's going to happen to them, right? So one day I went to him, he called me to give me a job, and gave me the copy, and he said, "When can you deliver it?" I said, "Well, 2 weeks will be all right." He said, "Yeah, man." I said, "Yeah, man, you see, you're becoming a Jamaican yourself. Where you learn yeah, man from?" He said, "I learned it from the workers." I said, "You soon won't be a Chinese, right? You're going to speak Patois now." So you see, culture is a thing that it has to be practiced,
Chinese Jamaican families often sent their eldest sons to China to learn the language and the customs of their homeland.
I came up here because my parents wanted me to come up here to study Chinese tradition, like learn some more Chinese into me. because, they're from China, so they wanted me to come up as a son, as their son, to come up here to study, to know more about the culture of China.
My father took me and my brother, then Vincent, to China. The idea is that he want me and my brother to learn Chinese culture. You understand? And that's in 1933.
Totally different world. For example, like the Chinese culture, comparing to in Jamaica now, it's a big difference, very big difference. I took years to get used to it. Whatever I'm used to in Jamaica, you can't find that at all in China, nothing. Jamaican food is always what I pick first because I think it's more healthy. Not too much fried or too much oil, but it's not bad, but it's a good change in life.
We only have a small piece of land. The land don't produce enough for this family. And my father cannot send money back to China at that time because during the World War, everything cut off. Pearl Harbor thing, after that, everything cut off. No money came from Jamaica. So what we have to use our little resources we have. And we have to, the best thing what we eat, I know, the sweet potato cooked with the rice. That's the best meal I ever have. Every week, maybe we have one time of that. But during the week, rice porridge and leaf mixed with rice flour. And we go through it. Months, we don't eat meat. We don't know what name meat. We don't know what name sweets.
I miss the beach, Lime Key, and I miss the resorts. Yeah. And I heard that there are more resorts that I miss. Like, I've been up here for 10 years now, so I miss a lot. The parties and everything. I'm still young, so still into the partying feel and the food. It's food like ackee and saltfish and steamed fish and okra with crackers and chicken foot soup and all those good stuff.
1948, my father have a big business. He need help. That time I was 18 years old. My father said, okay, I'm going to send my son came back to Jamaica to help me. So he sent me back to Jamaica. And my mother, first time he saw me, she was crying. Oh, my son's so smart. 18 years old. And just like a boy, little bit of boy. But she took me to doctor. Doctor said, your son is starving before. Now you need nutrition. What my mother gave me now, those days have younger stove from England. She gave me one younger stove with condensed milk per day. And the doctor said that I must feed me with Scotch in motion.
When I'm really settled down, everything that I'm working to now and my work and business and everything, after maybe in a year time, I will go back to Jamaica for a vacation for a month or two and, relax and get back some good food.
My mother about 19 to 20. She go to China with my father. And we have a little house in China. So we all live together. My father, Chinese wife, and Jamaican wife. Then live together, then live so harmony, no quarreling. And my Chinese mother loved my mother so much, like sister.
When Mr. Chang speaks fondly of his Chinese mother and his Jamaican mother, he is speaking of the dual family situation that was common for the early generation of Chinese men who came to Jamaica.
Those Chinese men had actually left, in many cases, wives and families back in China. So they arrived there essentially on their own, and once they came even off the plantations and began to set up their own shops and their own enterprises, Afro-Jamaican women tended to comprise a big part of their client base, and of course even their workforce, because the women would be hired to work on the shop counter and so on. So over the course of time, relationships would form between these men, and not only with Afro-Jamaicans, but also with some of the other races who came over.
So most of the Chinese people who migrate here, they have two wives. My mother, Chinese mother, named Chow. My Jamaican mother is named Lu.
We need to appreciate the fact that the Chinese were often polygamous, okay? So it was quite possible for you to have a wife in China and a wife in Jamaica.
Many instances of interracial mixing, even though they weren't actually married, there was a lot of interracial mixing, because we know from the census in the late 19th century that there was a whole group of people who were then listed as being mixture of Chinese and blacks. So they were big enough, significant enough to form a group. And it's from that time that we got this expression about Chinese royal. Describes any child who is the mixture of black and Chinese. The Chinese from China described those of us who were born in Jamaica, even if we weren't mixed, like myself, describe us as Shipyet Damjai, that is the 11 o'clock children. And I've always wondered 11 o'clock children, because we never made it to the full noon, we were 11 o'clock children. So that they distinguished between us and those who were actually born in China.
The mixed Chinese children, first of all, we full Chinese children thought that they were so good looking and more beautiful than we were. They were very much accepted by their parents, and they were treated just like their full Chinese children. So this is why they were sent back to China, even when they were physically did not look full Chinese.
Chinese were able to, over the course of time, integrate themselves into what was then still a developing fabric of Jamaican society.
The interweaving of Chinese Jamaicans within the broader Jamaican population and culture was perhaps best reflected in their contribution to the Jamaican sound, as Jamaicans of Chinese descent became leading players in the burgeoning music scene from the 1960s.
The importance of the Chinese in Jamaica to the development of our popular music is very important.
Jamaica globally is most known because of its music. I mean, reggae is a global music.
The significance might not be from the point of view of them being artists, though quite a few were, but more from the point of view of them assisting quote-unquote local artists in the very early stages to record music.
The singers and instrumentalists were Afro-Jamaicans, and the rhythm and vocal patterns undoubtedly rooted in the African tradition. But the studio space, equipment, and overall creative supervision came from several Chinese Jamaicans, like Byron Lee.
Everybody knows Byron Lee. Byron Lee has to be given the credit for popularizing ska and reggae. But Byron, even as he was doing that, he appeared and wrote songs for Dr. No, which in 1962, right after independence, was a huge global hit. A Hollywood film that was filmed here in Jamaica, the first James Bond film.
Other Chinese, such as Vincent Chin, also saw the potential. He went even further and set up his own studio and distribution center, recording a lot of early Jamaican music, including people like Rico Rodriguez in the pre-ska days, Lord Creator, later on Peter Tosh, perhaps a couple of sides by the Wailers, but among many others, Don Drummond, Scatolites. Vincent went deep into it, and that family made their life's ambition realized by producing Jamaican music.
They established VP Records after Vincent and Patricia in New York in 1979. VP became the best-known and most influential reggae distributor in North America. Another influential producer in the early days of Jamaican music production was Leslie Kong. Kong's family owned an ice cream parlor and record store named Beverly's, but would dive into the music business after an intriguing encounter that led Kong to record Jimmy Cliff.
Based solely on his persistence to be recorded. And so he pursued a businessman, Leslie Kong, who ran basically what we call in Jamaica an ice cream parlor. He asked him to record him. And whereas Leslie might be a little much wanting to think about it positively, he then had his brothers whom he had to consult with since it wasn't a solely operated business. The long and the short is that Jimmy came back a day or two later with the lyrics of a song praising Beverly.
You know I love you, Beverly.
And it impressed the Kong brothers. And so Leslie went ahead and recorded Jimmy Cliff. All of Jimmy's earliest hits, Hurricane Hattie,
I'll be like Hurricane Hattie.
Lion Say,
The lion says, I am king.
among others, were recorded for the Beverly's label.
Cliff sourced talent for Kong's label, named Beverly's, and brought Bob Marley to Kong.
A young Bob Marley, a welder at the time, Robert or Nestor Marley, as he was called then, was brought to Beverly's, where he also cut his first two sides.
One Cup of Coffee. And later, Judge Not. Kong was known as the Chinaman in the country's music circles and quickly became Jamaica's leading producer of local popular music in the 1960s.
He produced Israelites, which was the first international #1 that was totally made in Jamaica.
Get up in the morning, slaving for bread, sir.
He produced 007 for Desmond Dekker. If you had to name the 20 greatest Jamaican songs ever, Leslie Kong would have had a hand in a significant number of them. In fact, the first record album that was a global hit for Jamaicans, The Harder They Come. It consists largely of Leslie Kong produced songs, and people don't tend to remember that.
Kong died from a heart attack at the peak of his music business in 1971. A year later, Jojo Who Kim and his brothers opened up the legendary Channel One and had their first hit single with It's a Shame by Delroy Wilson in 1973.
It's a shame for what you've done to me.
We usually buy records from the producer and from the record artists. So we get to know them before we enter the music business. Well, we usually like music, like how music play, like how something sound good. Something don't sound bad, we always go and criticize it, say it don't sound good, although you might say it sound good. Well, John will invite me to Dynamic. He had a session there. And the minute I step into Dynamic and I start to play, to myself, I said, this is it. This is what I wanted. And that's how Channel One started.
During the 1970s, some of Jamaica's most popular music came out of Channel One, which is credited for having created the roots reggae style known as rockers. Through state-of-the-art equipment and the innovations of the studio's backing band, made up of Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare, aka Sly and Robbie, among others, Channel One established a new style that laid the groundwork for the early dance hall sound.
We had a set of musicians who would have worked with us, meaning we want to hear something different. And to be honest with you, when him taking the drum and taking the, to balance up everything, take hours. And they were willing to stay with us hours before taking it. Other musicians never up to that.
I think the main thing that turned out the music in the 70s is a different sound.
Right.
We come up with a different sound. And that is, I think, is a major thing why the music really start listening to.
In 1977, Hu Kim relocated to New York following the shooting death of his brother, thus leading to the eventual decline of the studio. The departure of Hu Kim to North America reflected the sentiment of many Chinese Jamaicans at the time. The democratic socialist policies of the Michael Manley-led government of the 1970s, combined with increasing political violence and economic contraction, spurred mass migration from the middle and upper classes, including Chinese Jamaicans.
A number of Chinese came to Jamaica because of communism. So when they heard that Jamaica might implement democratic socialism, which is probably the cousin of communism, many Chinese ran. And they ran to places like Canada, where in the 1960s they implemented the point system. So many Chinese immigrants were qualified to migrate to Canada. Many went to the States, where they had some family connection, and there were some who went to the UK.
You know, once we start moving into the election campaign, come about before 1976 or thereabout, you find that people are getting a little bit more boisterous, okay, a little bit more aggressive, because the whole notion, the ideology of democratic socialism being branded about in those days, I think it did cause a split, a schism between I would say the people who, the middle class and upper middle class and so on. And the Chinese have always deemed to have money, okay, if you don't know better, okay, but anyway. So you find that, the whole notion that, I'm going to take away your house and drive your car and this and that, is something that I hear growing up. That time I was about 16, 17, okay, very impressionable, okay.
The mood of the country was one of uncertainty, I would say, in terms of the political system, certainly. There were a lot of feelings about, people thinking that we're going to be going with Cuba at the time.
It was not helped by Mr. Manley's two famous speeches, one saying that there are 5 flights a day to Miami and anybody who didn't like democratic socialism can leave, or his other famous speech saying that he saw himself as walking hand in hand with Fidel Castro up the mountainside.
It was a really tense atmosphere, but everyone felt it. I mean, we're just coming off of a state of emergency in 1976. There's a lot of political tension happening leading up to the election in 1980. There was a lot of violence based on just the color you were wearing, the party that you supported. So it was a really tense atmosphere. There were a lot of food shortages because foreign exchange was low. The economy was declining significantly. Between 1972 and about 1980, we lost about maybe 20% of the economy. So it was a very tense atmosphere, and everyone was thinking of migrating at the time.
This was a period of great social change, but as often happens when you have social reform, there is social resistance, because those who had benefited from the previous dispensation would not easily give up rights and privileges which they had long had.
People were just leaving the country and selling their assets for little or nothing.
So a lot of the Chinese businesses or people who were in business began to feel that they should seek greener pastures or places where they will be less threatened economically.
There's greatest concerns, and I'm not passing judgment, when your professional groups start migrating. And I would think that as we look back realistically, it was uncertainty about the the future of the society, which led to this migration. And by then, most of the Chinese, although originally coming here as indentured servants, by making use of education opportunities, they were professionals or successful business persons. So they fell in that group, which had questions about their own future in the Jamaican society.
It started off very small in many ways. I mean, I knew neighbors on either side of me. You would see these huge trailers parked outside on the sidewalks and stuff being slowly moved into the trailers, and then 2 or 3 weeks later the trailers would have disappeared. So we know that they were selling, getting as much as they possibly could. In fact, my own house, I credit to Mr. Manley, because the owners of the house were willing to sell it at a much reduced rate, because they were so desperate to get out and wanted to leave by the October of that year, because that was when we were going to have the general elections.
And a lot of the well-to-do or Chinese and even other Jamaicans, they took up that offer, okay, to leave, okay.
There were so many techniques and ways that Jamaicans found to get money out of the island. In fact, I heard of one particular case where the man stuffed the wheels of the trailer with money. I don't know the details of how he was planning to get it back out. Escape me, but the Chinese society was laughing as a whole about it, and how stupid he was. Because what happened was, when the trailer reached the wharf, it was just lifted off, leaving the tires behind, and the trailer was then put in. So who ended up with the money in the tires? I really have no idea.
One of the upshots of that massive emigration of the late 70s was that large Hakka communities were established and strengthened in North America, particularly in Toronto, Miami to Fort Lauderdale, and New York City, since the vast majority of Chinese Jamaicans are Hakka.
It was not very easy to get set up in business in Toronto or in Canada per se, because we didn't really have any experience of business. And it was very strange dealing with another kind of ethnic origin, and like the older generation, our older generation, they spoke broken English, patois. So speaking to a Canadian customer was very difficult, and also the goods that they had to carry. Most went into convenience stores, like a mom and pop corner store. We just fitted in because our generation was young and resilient, but the elders had more difficulty because they didn't have a profession, and they were trying to do business as they had learned in Jamaica, and they had to relearn about dealing with the Canadian public. Well, things didn't work out for all of us, but for those who didn't work out, we always kept a network and seemed to help each other. And our elders who were shopkeepers, they also closed their business or sold it out or took their loss, or the children would also come in and assist, even after their own work.
The decades since the 1970s have seen the reemergence and integration of the Chinese in Jamaica.
With the establishment of the free zone, which invited the whole garment industry to be developed here, okay, through the Caribbean Initiative, or Basin Initiative, the CBI, where Jamaica got quotas for assembling or making, garments here, okay. So you find that a lot of the factories were established here, set up here. They are from Hong Kong and from China. You find that the ones from Hong Kong would have, on the upper level management, supervisory level, and up there, they're from Hong Kong. You find that the people who are doing the basic stitching and sewing and so on, or the supervisory level, they're from inside China, okay. And I think in those days, the free zone employed 6 to 10 or 1,000 people, or could be more. I don't have the exact figures, But it was a big operation, okay. And it was going on very well until NAFTA came into being in the late 1980s, where the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico, Canada, and United States, that caused the whole CBI wasn't as attractive as before for those factory operators. So a lot of them move out to either Mexico, to Mexico really mostly.
The village Chinese shop of yesteryear has transformed into retail superstores and shopping complexes. Jamaicans of Chinese descent have also entered the professional ranks, becoming doctors and opticians, bankers, politicians. Importantly, they have played a role in creating the Jamaica of today, and several are among the most recognized Jamaicans and have created well-known and enduring establishments.
I started Missionaries of the Poor 32 years ago, but Missionaries of the Poor is a Jamaican order. It's founded in Jamaica, and it was the inspiration of the Lord because of all the homeless and destitute people and the prisoners that I visited, and a kind of a drive to be authentic. Either I was going to be truly a man of God or I'm not.
I left school, I think, in 1957. I worked as a lab technician in university, getting £7.10, and I was able to save money. I saved some money. Of course, I was wondering, what do I do? And the only thing that I really like, and I said I could make a living out of, was agricultural chemistry. So that's what I was going to do. But I would have to pay myself to go to university. And then I got a sales job that promised me everything. And at that time, I was a very shy person. I didn't know if I would do well at sales. So they had me selling water softener, which is the most difficult thing to sell and the most infrequent thing to sell. And I labored on the road. I didn't have a car. I walked. I borrowed the sales manager car sometime. And they were quite impressed with what I do. And then they promised me a lot of things. And so I decided, let me try the sales. And instead, so I left the pharmacology division in university. And of course, I did fairly well in sales, but they promised me a lot of things which never came. So after 2 years, I left with only £175 saving, an old Woolsey car, and I start the business in half of a rented house in Meadowbrook. So I started with selling black pepper and peas. Remember now, it's only £175 I have, so that can't really start a business. So I did it on a commission basis. So I booked black pepper from Singapore and Sarawak, and at that time, black pepper price was fluctuating a lot because people were really manipulating the market. But I deal honest with people. And when the price rise or double, I give it to them. My competitors, when it double, they say the order was not confirmed and buy it and take it for themselves. So I never do that. And in 1 year, I got 50% of the whole total import business. So the whole philosophy and what was we learned by young people and even old people, if you deal honestly with people, you can really make a success.
The influence of the Chinese is ever present in Jamaica, probably no more so than through food.
The Chinese are very deep in their culture. And in my days, there were many Chinese dinner for Chinese New Year, which is held in February of each year. They are very deep in the food they serve.
This whole integration of Chinese culture into the Jamaican society is our present predilection for Chinese food as we know it. But the majority Hakka people who would have had their base in the south and southeast of China, who came over initially, brought their cuisines and their style of cooking with them. These choices would have sort of been strange to the mostly Afro-Jamaican population at first, but as food shops proliferated and Chinese shops in general and the choices kind of became a little bit more available, the food was gradually integrated into Jamaican society to the point where you may have people thinking that what we are technically calling Chinese food is not necessarily of Chinese origin. There are people who would have thought certain dishes are local dishes, and there are some people who would prefer, some Jamaicans who would prefer Chinese dishes to our traditional oxtail or ackee and saltfish and so on.
Chinese give me this whole different flavor, different kind of cuisine, different cooking. I like the seasons that are involved and such. Curried shrimp, my thing that with fried rice.
I thought sweet and sour chicken was Jamaican. But
yeah, trust me.
Curry shrimp, slap with.
Amazing.
Chinese dinner on a Sunday, especially if we're lazy to cook.
Dim sum is basically a lot of smaller dishes being served on continuously in the morning to really whenever. Okay, you can have it as breakfast in the morning, and then but if you you can have friends coming over to your table until 3-4 hours later. So you basically lime, you eat, drink some more tea, eat some more, get some more friends to come over. So it's for fellowship, it's for gathering of your friends and family.
Chinese do the best cooking. Everybody loves Chinese food. The Chinese food now is clean and nutrition. Then say in Chinese food now in China Hakka Kong set mui hiong color and the taste and the smelling. As you bring out dish of Chinese food come, it smells so good and the color so good and everything's good. Nutrition, the most important, we're talking about nutrition. We don't do anything cooking without good for your body. That's the Chinese food.
And on the other side, you have a lot of Chinese Jamaicans who have come to prefer the Jamaican style food over the Chinese food.
I started to like ackee and saltfish because the flavors sound like China dishes, and it's ackee. It's weird food. It's strange food to me. It's not veggie. It's not meat. It's just a new thing to me.
The Chinese try to retain their cultural background.
The Chinese culture has had a significant impact on our culture in so many ways, in our ethnicity. My maternal grandfather was from China. His name was Mr. Ho Sang. And so I too have strong Chinese roots. And I remember watching my grandfather growing up in different ways, in the way that he took care of people, in the way that he had a shop beside the house, in the ways that he would cook, and the ways that he would eat a lot of vegetables. And that has also, I think, passed down to generations, even if you did not have Chinese as a ethnic group in your own family. What you see, even in the rural areas, as a member of parliament, I can tell you that people have adopted living at their business place. So you find Jamaicans now live upstairs and have their hardware downstairs. You find in the little shops around the countryside, people sell in different weights and measurements. You can buy, a little bit of butter, or you can buy a whole piece of the butter. And I would dare say, in the way that we play games of chance, and we enjoy playing games of chance.
Gambling is a part of some Chinese men and some Chinese women. One of the chief type of gambling is playing mahjong. And this mahjong became an habit that they could not break. It was a part of them. There is another form of gambling that takes place by Jamaicans as well, and this is a form of drop pan.
Drop pan is now marketed by Supreme Ventures as cash pot.
People used to run up there to buy. They had vendors selling down seafoods, and them used to come down and give you a rake. You probably them talking to somebody, and them scratch them head.
they would know, well, probably can't go and buy number 12 because if Chinaman go and play 12. Or if you play 12 now, and them would under 12 and they would look for the same is happening now in the cash pot where they have the same numbers with the same symbols like 12, number 12 would be for the head and so on.
The many decades since the 19th century, Chinese culture has gradually woven into the Jamaican fabric. There is a new wave of Chinese into Jamaica that will need to find their way within this fabric. Shopkeepers too, but of different backgrounds than the original Hakka who came during the 18 and 1900s.
I've heard that it's a different set of Chinese, meaning they've come from a different part of China.
The new immigrants, obviously, they don't really speak Hakka. Most of them speak Mandarin, okay? And obviously the ones from Hong Kong, they speak Cantonese, okay? But they begin their whole new cycle of immigration, okay? In the case of people who are operating this from the mainland, they would try to get their cousins or brother or sister coming to help them as the business grows, okay? So you find that this is sort of a different cycles of immigration.
I think the first generation is mostly South China people, Guangdong, Fujian, and mostly Guangdong I heard, and they are quite hopeless when they leave their home. They have no choice, and they have to find good life out there, even though they don't know Jamaica is maybe worse than China. And new generation, they chose to come because they heard good stories about getting rich, about having good life in Jamaica, compared with very competitive life they have in China.
As the traditional source of Hakka people coming from China diminishes, okay, and that is due to the relative wealth that they have gained over the years, okay, especially the Dongguan area where our Hakka people would come from. You find that the area is now very much developed. The farmlands that they used to own, they would sell it to the factory owners who would run factories there, and they get good rental money from the farmlands. And in some cases, the developers would take their land and give them some houses, which they can get rentals from. So they no longer have the desire to come to Jamaica from these Hakka villages, unlike before, okay, but they were dirt poor and just lucky to find an opportunity to go overseas, okay, and seek for a better life. So you find that in place of the Hakkas, this new wave of immigrants from different provinces now, no longer limits to a 5 miles, geography 5 miles, unlike the Hakka people. They come from everywhere, Sichuan, they come from Guangxi or Guilin, or they come from Lanzhou, which is in the west. In the north, it could be Jiangsu, which is in the east or east-west. So you find that the Chinese coming from all over.
I was not unfamiliar with Jamaica before I came here. I know Jamaica is a very small country. I know its location. I know Usain Bolt, which is very famous in China as well. And I also know about Mali. Yeah, that's all I know about Jamaica. I wouldn't expect there are Chinese people in Jamaica before I came here. I have no idea the Chinese people living here. That was from my first time experience. I met a few Chinese people. They are shopkeepers. The first time I met them, I feel really surprised.
The cohesiveness which we enjoy as a Hakka people, we've enjoyed that for over 100 years, okay, 130 odd years until the 1980s and 1990s. That has changed, okay. Those are left behind and work in Jamaica with the Hakka, heritage. We're very much together, okay. But it's becoming diluted as you go into the third and fourth, and sometimes fifth generation. So you find that to continue that culture is a challenge, and that's why you have CBA. We try to teach, different things, language, about our culture, about tradition, was to try to, mold our youngsters coming up, to let them know that, look, this is your Hakka culture, this is the Chinese culture. And because of the language barrier that we have between the newcomers and these second and third or fourth generation Chinese, they speak Mandarin, but most of us don't. And hence the challenge. How do we integrate or get the Mandarin speaking ones to join with the CBA so that they can help us to enjoy or to expand the Chinese culture that we have been trying to pass on.
The continued influx of Chinese immigrants is reinforced by closer bilateral ties, particularly via Chinese investment in the construction of roadways, stadiums, and other infrastructural and cultural projects.
Jamaica was one of the first independent countries, maybe the first in the Western Hemisphere, to declare what is called in international jargon a one China policy. We recognize the People's Republic of China as the representative of Chinese people.
For Jamaica to have recognized China back in the days of 1972, when you find your true friend is when you're poor, okay? Or when you don't want nobody to let you know no umbrella when the sun is shining, okay? It's only when the rain fall, okay? So in this case, when the rain was falling, Jamaica lent China an umbrella.
It is very significant and hardly a coincidence that we have just recently celebrated 40 years of diplomatic relationship between our two countries. It is imperative that it be remembered that it was the Michael Manley-led administration in 1972 which formally recognized the People's Republic of China.
Ever since we established diplomatic relations with China, that relationship has grown, has strengthened, and I think in this period a very mature relationship has emerged. In that process, we've had significant exchange programs with China in a variety of areas, all of them very key to our growth and development here in Jamaica. We have in recent times been sending persons for training at all levels in key areas as logistics, construction, science, energy, a range of fields that will have a positive and continue to have a positive impact.
The Jamaicans have failed to be creative enough to use up our resources, and the Chinese see where they can also use our resources, not only use them, but use the different skills that they have, which the Jamaicans lack or shortfall on, and capitalize on it and make more money here in Jamaica.
In terms of the reduction of the skills gap between where we are in the construction field and where the Chinese are, the only answer is it's twofold. One is training, and by working through UTech, HEART, and in more recent times, the Caribbean Maritime Institute, we're seeking to train people with specific skill sets in mind rather than a general training as such. And what we now need to do is to put those young graduates with more experienced persons, expatriates, such that they can learn by doing and apply that which they have learned within those institutions.
Chinese investment point of view, that has been critical to Jamaica's growth. If you look at the 20th century, for example, the Chinese community was very significant in terms of a lot of the shops downtown, the downtown business district. They also were very instrumental in setting up a lot of businesses across the island, in particular restaurants, wholesales, those things that drive economic activity day to day. So they were very instrumental. More recently, we've seen Chinese investments in terms of large infrastructural projects. The highways, China Harbor has been involved in that, and their investment has been significant in Jamaica. So I mean, I don't think that Jamaica could have done without the influx of Chinese investments. They're a very entrepreneurial class.
The development of island Jamaica has been shaped by a mix of influences from Europe to Africa to Asia.
The Chinese, like other groups that have come here, came here in search of an opportunity. And in coming here, they saw the opportunity to build and forge a new society, forge a new country, forge something in our own images. And uniquely, to a large degree, set free from the constraints of the old and the past to build something new for ourselves. Something that blended the different experiences and the different histories and the different cultures. And I think Jamaica and the wider Caribbean is unique in that way.
In the over 160 years since the first Chinese arrived on the island following the end of slavery, Jamaica has transitioned from post-emancipation to an independent nation trying to survive in a cosmopolitan world. China has come full circle, regaining the prominence it had enjoyed towards the end of the 18th century, to become the second largest economy in the world today. The British brought various people to this former sugar colony. Chinese Jamaicans moved from the plantations to set up shops in villages across Jamaica. Several Chinese have since come to call Jamaica home, and Jamaicans have grown to accept Mr. Chin as part of their society. Thus, the Dragon and the Junkanoo dance. A dance in which each side has at times embraced, but at times been guarded. But a dance that has altered the beat of each. And so, the beat goes on.